Hello, great to have you back for more VLGA Connect. I'm Chris Eddy. Good to be with you, and thanks to Hunt and Hunt Lawyers, our sponsors, for making these programs possible. And Tony Raunic from Hunt and Hunt is back again this week. We're looking at a recent decision at Port Phillip involving its local law and the treatment of homeless encampments. It's a hot and topical issue in the local government sector right now. But first up, we're going to be joined by the Mayor of Latrobe City Council to talk local issues as that region undergoes economic transition. Stay with us for this edition of VLGA Connect. And the Mayor of Latrobe City Council, Councillor Sharon Gibson, joins me now. Sharon, lovely to have you on VLGA Connect.
Thank you very much for having me.
We've seen some announcements out of Latrobe in recent times, which they have a bit of a theme to them. It's all about economic structural transition down there in Latrobe. Can you just set the scene for us? Big changes happening in your part of the world.
Well, big change is happening, and we really need to diversify our economy because we are the most affected area in the country. Nowhere else has got and had 5 power stations that are been taken out of the economy. We've had Morwell, we've had Hazelwood, we're about to have your lawn all shut down. Then you've also had the timber industry shut down as well, and then we've got the 2 Loy Yang power stations that are to shut down. So, nowhere else has that, and they're all in Latrobe City.
It's pretty extraordinary when you put it that way. And it's not that long since I've been for a drive through Gippsland, and I was just thinking about the imposing nature of those facilities on the landscape when they all shut down and disappear in some way. It's also going to look very different, isn't it?
Well, it is looking very different. Now, when you used to come over a hill, you would see Hazelwood Power Station to the right in the distance, and that's all gone now. It's just not there. So it is very different. The part that's really concerning here, though, is the jobs.
Yeah.
You know, your lawn alone was over 1,000 workers. Now, for each direct job, you have indirect jobs, and depending which calculation you want to use, whether it's for every direct job, there's 4 indirect jobs. So you're looking at thousands of jobs. And when you equate that with successive power stations that are shutting down, if you don't start diversifying your economy, you're in trouble.
Yeah. So you've called for a more coordinated approach to this transition, which implies there are some gaps in the way the state and the federal governments are approaching this. What are those gaps in your view that you'd like to see addressed?
Look, if we don't align the workers when they're losing their jobs with other industries or jobs, there's a real problem there, and there's a real gap. And it actually affects not just the worker, it's their whole family. So, there is a gap there in timing, if you like. Where are they to go? What are they to do? And the transition that we're calling for is to close the gaps.
So you're obviously talking to state and federal departments about that as part of your advocacy. Your advocacy goes beyond just the energy sector, though, doesn't it? Because you're looking for new and different ways of activating the local economy. We've just had an announcement this week, Sharon, I notice, of drones at the airfield. Is that an example of the out of the box sort of thinking that you want to see more of?
It is out of the box, and that is what we're looking at, because we realise that it can't be the same as what it was. So we're looking at how do we diversify our economy? We have to think outside the square, outside the box. What are we doing? So we're really looking at, okay, what industries can we put down here? One of them is the announcement that you did see about the drones. Now we have There's a company that's going to actually set up the command center, if you like, for drones, and they're looking at testing the drones and then manufacturing drones. So that's an industry that we're in a unique position to actually do, because our airspace, if you like, has got a lot of buffer zones with the power stations and the like. So there is areas that the testing can be done. So it's a unique opportunity for us to capitalize on.
Mm. So is that going to create a lot of jobs, or are there other sectors you particularly want to see some focus on to create the sorts of jobs, the numbers of jobs that you're needing to replace with the demise of the power stations?
That is part of the equation. It's not all of the equation, because
Mm.
it's not going to replace the power station or
Mm.
the jobs at all. That's not going to happen, but it is part of the equation. There's a couple hundred jobs potentially with that. You also have it was a place right at the airport again. The airport's going to be a very productive centre, because we had the only manufacturer of airplanes in Australia there. It was sold to Mahindra, and through that it went down to virtually nothing. Now it's been bought back,
Mm.
and it's back up to 60 workers and growing. So that's another part where there's another industry that potentially could be another bow in the arrow, if you like, and that's about making transmission towers here. Instead of going
Oh.
overseas, okay, you say, oh, well, you can't compete with the price, but what is the full price? Now, if you get the transmission towers overseas, do you remember the accident that happened? Well, the catastrophe, whatever adjective you want to use, when the power towers fell over and it
Mm.
blacked us all out.
Yeah.
Well, that's an example of what I'm talking about, because overseas their steel is not the same grade as our steel. So our steel is a lot stronger and better. So, okay, you can go for the cheap price, is what you think you're getting a great bargain, but you're going to have to replace the towel. It's quicker, because the steel, it won't stand up to the time
Mm.
that the our steel will. So that's one part. Then it's the time factor. So you manufacture here, it's going to be quicker. And especially if you're setting up transmission towers near us, again, it's going to be quicker. You can build them nearly on site, but you can build them close to the site and erect them. So
Mm.
again, that's saving time. Now, if you take that out of the equation and you don't have the jobs, well, what's going to happen? You've got a lot of people on unemployment benefits. You have, with that, always comes mental health issues.
Mm.
So the cost of those two things, without people who are working and paying tax, which would you do?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a bit of a wicked problem, isn't it? As
Mm.
as you've explained it, I notice in a lot of your recent statements, the issue of community sentiment has been central to those. How are you balancing what the community wants to see happen as it goes through this change with the realities, I guess, of what's possible and what's not?
Well, I don't think, in my opinion, we haven't explored the opportunities as much as we could. Okay, and the the average person on the street down here wants hope. They want a future that they can see. In the past, they knew that if you wanted a job, there was a job available. and you had security. They don't have that now. So they really want job security and a future with hope. So on the ground, that's what they want. As for what the jobs are, look, at this point in time, I don't believe that the community is as picky, if you like, about the jobs. You know, they want to put bread and butter on their table, and that's what it's about. Give us hope, give us a future, so our kids can grow up here and they can stay here if they
Mm,
wish.
mm. Very well said. So obviously that's central to the discussions you're having with state and federal bureaucrats and MPs, as we mentioned earlier. This is, I think, your third time in the mayoral seat. Is this the most challenging time for you to be mayor compared to your previous stints?
Look, it'd be right up there with the mine fire. I was the mayor during the mine fire, and I just had major back surgery and came home to that. So I was on a cocktail of painkillers,
Mm.
and I didn't realize that one of them actually gives you speech impediment and memory losses.
Oh.
So don't look at any of those interviews because, oh yes, it was a hard time, but I made sure that I was one of the first in the office and one of the last each and every day because what was how could I as mayor say you go to work when I wasn't?
Mm. All right, look, it's been great to meet you and to talk to you as your region goes through this very considerable and significant change. And I'd love to keep in touch and hear about progress along the way, hopefully positive news in the not too distant future. Mayor Sharon Gibson from Latrobe City Council, thank you for coming on VLGA Connect.
You're very welcome, and I would love to be able to come and speak to you with any positives that come out of this with the state and federal government, because we actually have been the reason why Victoria has prospered over 100 odd years.
Mm.
Now it's our turn for help.
Good luck with all of that, and thanks for your time. Great to see you.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Now, Tony Raunic is back with us this week from Hunt and Hunt Lawyers to talk about another hot issue in the sector right now. Hello, Tony. Welcome back.
Thanks, Chris. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. Now, a real hot topic at the moment is how local governments deal with homelessness. I've chatted to the author of a new study at the University of New South Wales, which has looked at this issue across Australia. So it's a
Mm.
broad issue. And you've got some news this week on how the particular issue is being dealt with locally in the city of Port Phillip.
Yes, that's right, Chris. Well, recently, this month, City of Port Phillip considered amendments to their community amenity local law that dealt with encampments. So people sleeping out, sleeping rough on public land. And that was addressed at a council meeting on Wednesday, the 6th of May. And council did resolve to make changes to that local law. And the changes allow council officers to direct a person to remove their encampment equipment from public land. And if the person doesn't comply with that direction, that for the council officers to potentially seize the personal items, some even some bedding, but could be often shopping trolleys and this sort of thing where people store their effects. And allows council officers to seize those personal items where it's in response to perceived anti-social behaviour, Chris. And this was a
Yeah.
really highly contested issue. It was passed on a 5-4-3 against resolution with one
Mm.
abstention. And despite a survey that City of Port Phillip had undertaken itself, where out of 708 respondents, 76% opposed the proposal.
Right.
But there was feedback still on both sides of the arguments. Victoria Police supported the proposed amendment to local law. Many of the community service providers in the area spoke against the proposed changes. And they're sort of in response to some perceived problems in the area, particularly in a public car park, the Jackson Street car park. In late 2024, council came to council's attention that there were groups of 10 or 15 people sort of gathering there, particularly in the evenings, with their personal effects, belongings, bikes, this sort of thing. And there were public community complaints about perceived aggressive behaviour, visible drug use, accumulation of rubbish, these things. And that led council into investigating, well, what can we do as a council to address this issue?
You mentioned about the survey and 76% opposing, and ordinarily you'd think that's a pretty strong response to an issue. Of course, last week we spoke about Yarra's traffic issue, and that was pretty unprecedented. So this looks pretty minor in comparison, but it's drawn some pretty strong responses, including from a local MP who's actually accused the council of overreach here and insisted that they overturn that decision. I think he's then come in for some criticism for getting involved in what's a really contentious and difficult issue to manage.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to where we started on this topic, Chris, when you mentioned that University of New South Wales study, because I think one of the things that study identified was that, yeah, while councils don't have a formal role often in dealing with this issue of homelessness, and that presumably is part of the reasoning of the local MP who says, would say, well, it's not council's role, you've overreached your responsibilities here. What in fact does happen is that council are the entity on the ground receiving the complaints, either from the community members who perceive that they feel unsafe, or where there's incidents of crime, or rubbish accumulation, private landowners upset with what's occurring in the vicinity of their property. So council really have some ethical, if you like, responsibility to respond to these concerns.
They also need to have regard to legal considerations too, don't they? So the City of Moreton Bay in Queensland has taken a pretty hardline approach to this issue, but they've run afoul of the Supreme Court there, and I think that was on human rights grounds from memory. Was the City of Port Phillip aware of and cognizant of that element?
Yeah, very much so, Chris. As you say, as City of Moreton Bay in Queensland in 2023 made some revisions to their local law, which essentially made camping on public land illegal. And that ultimately led to this Supreme Court of Queensland case that challenged the approach that council was taking there, and found that the City of Moreton Bay had, as you say, violated human rights of these homeless campers, essentially a breach of the equivalent to the Victorian Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities Act, in that the council at Moreton Bay, when it was evicting people from public parks, had made some errors, including disposing of people's private property without their consent. And so City of Port Phillip was very mindful of this, and there are some key differences between the approach that Port Phillip are taking and the Moreton Bay approach, and they're apparent from the officer's report in this matter. But firstly, there are human rights safeguards in the Port Phillip approach that weren't in the Moreton Bay approach. Firstly, at Port Phillip, there's an initial outreach before enforcement. There's only a seizing of private property where there's evidence that there's an adverse impact on the community from the encampments. It's not of itself just illegal to encamp, and there's this effort to engage with the persons who own the property to say, we please first remove the property. And also from an enforcement perspective, Port Phillip aren't looking at financial penalties here.
Yeah.
Moreton Bay, we're issuing fines, and interesting
Okay.
proposition, fining homeless people, also destroying their belongings, maybe their sleeping bags, their bedding, equipment, etc. At Port Phillip, I understand that if that property is seized and removed from the public land location, it will be available for collection at no charge, where the owner can go and collect it from a site,
Right.
a council site at no charge. So some substantial differences there.
Yeah.
And I think the mayor, Alex Macon, was keen to stress that these measures are a last resort. It's just one more tool to help manage this issue of people camping out
Mm.
in Port Phillip. So it's a much more moderate and measured response, but nonetheless, a lot of angst, Chris, and speakers against. Quoted in the media, the council to homeless persons, CEO Deborah Natale, saying that these sort of laws are dehumanising people. Don't forget that people who sleep rough, they tend to be the victims of crime more than anyone.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, those sorts of views have been heavily expressed.
Yeah, but as you say, it is a more measured approach than the Moreton Bay example. Interesting. When I spoke to Andrew Clark, who's the author of that UNSW report, I asked him how prevalent these more punitive approaches were, and it was interesting to hear him say that they actually weren't happening when they were doing their study over the last couple of years. They've only started to emerge very recently. So I guess it's another sign that this issue is becoming more and more problematic for councils, and they don't have the tools necessarily to deal with them.
Well, that's right, Chris. And I think another thing that University of New South Wales study, illustrates is that you go back, pre-COVID at least,
Mm.
um, um, not universally, but was perhaps at least perceived that this homelessness problem was largely an inner city municipality
Yes,
issue.
that's true. Yeah.
And post pandemic, we've seen, a greater sort of shortage of accommodation. And we're seeing that, across regional centres, rural townships, we're seeing this accumulation of this issue of homelessness. And I think the survey that University of New South Wales relied on talked about 2/3 of Australian councils now facing this,
Yes.
67% considering homelessness a significant or acute issue in their
Yes.
local area. And
Mm.
in the 2010s, it was 10% of
Yeah.
councils. So wow, what a
Right.
huge
Massive,
it's
and we also need to make the point it's not just an Australian problem. This is an
no.
issue globally as well. So I'm sure it's one we'll be talking more about. Okay, Tony, another very useful analysis. Thank you for taking a dive into that decision recently at the City of Port Phillip. It's always interesting to see how councils are tackling the issues of today. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. It's good to be here.
Tony Raunic there from Hunt and Hunt Lawyers. And that brings us to an end of another edition of VLGA Connect. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel to make sure you don't miss future episodes of VLGA Connect. The program is also available as an audio podcast, and you'll find it on all of the major podcast platforms. Until next week, thanks for watching and listening, and bye for now.